Between 30 and 313 AD, biblical Christianity survived Jewish and Roman persecution, and then came to dominate Western civilization from 313 to 1800 AD. It was foundational in the formulation of modern science, since it encourages observing and studying the natural order as God's handiwork. If the natural universe was designed and produced by a rational and consistent creator, then it could be understood to some degree by rational investigation. However, in recent years, it has become obvious that Christianity is losing its cultural acceptance in Europe and North America. One of the major reasons underlying the origins of this trend is that intellectuals from the later 1600s have heavily promoted the notion that reason and science, equated with the philosophy of materialistic naturalism, have replaced the biblical worldview as the truth about nature and the past. Once this view attained the status of dogmatic orthodoxy in Western universities, the rest is history.
I don't believe in God, first of all. Maybe because I grew up in an age of science.
I learned the Darwinian stories in school, but also at home because my dad was the biology department head at a state college in Michigan. I accepted the stories because my dad believed them and he was smart, and you are repeatedly told that all scientists and educated people believed them, and that the evidence for them was overwhelming. Well, my curiosity to understand reality lay dormant for several years as I finished a college degree. That's pretty sad, going to college without any personal critical thinking going on, just buy into the current agenda to pass classes and receive a degree. But a few years later, I was challenged by a friend to reconsider the Bible, and it came at a time when I was ready to begin using my brain, which was almost brand new as I had not used it much, and it had largely just been along for the ride during my first 20 years of life. Over the next year, I reread my old science textbooks, collected other books and journal articles, and began to realize that the nature stories that now dominate Western civilization were not nearly as scientific in the traditional sense of observation and evidence as I had been led to believe. I became increasingly skeptical of the new stories and comfortable with the Bible's assertions about nature and the past as simple but accurate portrayals of reality. With the literature emerging from the growing intelligent design community, it is obvious that many people with advanced degrees in different areas are seeing the same thing and rejecting Darwinism. I've produced 3 videos detailing why I rejected the Darwinian stories concerning life's origin and diversity, and humans as ape descendants. This video is an introduction to those 3 videos, explaining why biblical supernaturalism fell out of favor with European intellectuals, the primarily historical, cultural, and philosophical factors upon which the now popular replacement stories were formulated, and how science itself was corrupted as this worldview shift unfolded. To understand the stories for life's origin, diversity, and human origins that emerged between 1859 and 1871, you need to not only investigate those stories, but also the flow of history and philosophy that brings them about. A very similar worldview shift occurred 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece, and the nature stories that were formulated on the same philosophical beliefs have a predictable similarity to what we are hearing now. One of the lessons of history is that distorted supernaturalism tends to encourage atheism, and these 2 worldviews cause people to understand nature and the past very differently. The real underlying issue for these stories is the foundational philosophical assumption that one begins with: theism, belief in the supernatural, or atheism, rejection of the supernatural. The family of gods that began in Mesopotamia 3000 BC spread out and came to Greece around 800 BC, with Homer giving them Greek names and putting them on top of Mount Olympus. Later, the Romans would adopt these gods from the Greeks, give them Latin names, and put them in the Pantheon, a building housing all the gods in the city of Rome. But these gods were just bigger versions of sinful humans. So within a couple centuries, skeptical Greek intellectuals had enough of polytheistic supernaturalism and wanted to understand nature in terms of two secular philosophies, materialism and naturalism. Materialism is the belief that physical matter is the extent of reality, all there is. Naturalism is the belief that natural processes are the only shapers of matter into all of its forms, and it optimistically imagines these processes to have an inherent tendency to organize matter into ever higher levels of order, even capable of transforming inanimate matter into life. In the 6th century BC, the Greek philosophers Anaximander and Empedocles avoided the origin of life issue by imagining that matter was already alive. This is called hylozoism, and that nature makes experiments and the ones that work survive and thrive. Thus, the earliest and simple life forms began in the sea, and new forms developed later from successful experiments and adapting to new environments. Eventually, some form crawled onto land, survived, and continued the process. Humans must have developed from some earlier animal form. A couple centuries later, Plato and his student Aristotle rejected the materialistic naturalism view of nature as requiring too much fortunate chance. In the Great Chain of Being, Plato imagined that a perfect creator would have made all possible biological forms at the beginning, so there was no biological change over time. Aristotle imagined a prime mover that set all of nature in motion, with the earth fixed and unmoving at the center of the universe. Several centuries later, Christianity grew and thrived even under several centuries of Roman persecution. Realizing that the Roman Empire was dying and that Christianity had a good deal of inner strength, the Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 AD, and the Emperor Theodosius I closed the pagan temples in 381 AD, making Christianity, in effect, the new state religion of Rome, in the hope that it could salvage the empire. Christianized European civilization came to be known as Christendom. However, between 400 and 1800 AD, blending Christianity with Roman and then European civilization produced some serious distortions. The papacy, the scholastics, and the rise of the European universities exalting Plato and Aristotle's flawed notions of no variation biology and earth-centered cosmology, the Inquisition, divine right monarchies, Reformation warfare, and continuing theological hostilities. The distortions of Christendom developed as it slowly moved away from its biblical foundations, deserving criticism and reformation, which occurred in the 16th century. But post-Reformation secularists made no attempt to distinguish the foundations from the later distortions, and even blamed biblical supernaturalism for everything. Accordingly, towards the end of the 1600s, a movement of skeptics that had had enough of Christendom began in France, and it spread to disgruntled intellectuals elsewhere. This movement was the Enlightenment, and its primary goal was to bring an end to Christendom and move European society to an enlightened secularism. To accomplish that goal, a major worldview shift was needed, and they did what the 6th century BC Greek skeptics did to discredit Homer's gods on Olympus. First, they rejected supernaturalism in general. Then they embraced a philosophy of optimistic materialistic naturalism. Physical matter is all there is, and natural processes alone shape matter into all of its forms, with an inherent tendency for progress and upward development, even capable of producing life from non-life. This philosophical position was equated with reason and science so that only these kinds of stories would be allowed consideration. New stories would be formulated during the modern era to explain nature in the past according to the Enlightenment agenda, confident that evidence yet to be found would eventually support them. It was in this context that Lyell, Huxley, Haeckel, and Darwin developed and promoted stories for life's origin, diversity, and human origins, what we know as Darwinism, between 1859 and 1871. Between 1859 and 1871, 4 men were instrumental in providing new stories for life's origin, diversity, and human origins that contradicted what the Bible taught about life. In Genesis, we are told that the universe had a beginning, was intelligently designed, the early earth was covered with water before dry land appeared, that life comes from prior life, biogenesis, that major kinds of life forms appeared distinct and fully formed at about the same time, humans are a special creation, language, agriculture, and technology capable when they appeared, and there was a worldwide rainforest climate before a great extinction-level flood. How do you replace a well-established worldview? First, identify the ideas you want to discredit. In this case, everything Genesis said about nature and the past. Next, imagine the opposite of the ideas you want to replace and assume those new ideas to be true. No designer, eternal universe and eternal matter. The early earth was covered with hot magma. Water came later. Life arose from non-life, abiogenesis. Major life form groups emerged from earlier ones at different times. Humans arose from an earlier animal form. The early earth was like the current earth. The present is the key to the past. And there were no catastrophic events in earth history. Third, quietly shift the conception of science from following observation and evidence to philosophical doctrines about nature that rule out the ideas you hate and only allow consideration of the new stories. Materialism and naturalism, the nebular hypothesis, Darwinism, and uniformitarian geology. Label them reason and science stories, push them dogmatically as the only possible explanations, believed by all educated people, and supported by overwhelming evidence. Then ignore and explain away problems and protect your new stories from criticism. Thus, you have the basis for all of the Enlightenment's new stories for cosmology, Earth history, life, and human history. In 1859, Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species by Natural Selection to explain life's diversity, asserting that all life began with a simple single-celled protozoa, with minor inherited variations gradually accumulating over time to produce transformation by which all of the major groups gradually emerged from earlier groups at different times. Assuming that story to be true, in 1863, Charles Lyell and T.H. Huxley published books asserting that humans had evolved from an ape-like common ancestor, with Darwin adding his version in 1871. In 1868, T.H. Huxley and Ernst Haeckel believed they had evidence for life arising from primordial soup by means of inorganic platelets, or monera, in ocean floor slime. In 1871, Darwin responded to Joseph Hooker's question that life might have arisen from a fortunate mixture of chemicals in a warm little pond somewhere. These stories arising during this 12-year period were quickly adopted by secular-minded European intellectuals as the new sacred traditions about life in Western civilization, to be promoted as settled, rational, and scientific truth and the only possible explanations. Well, what's the problem? Well, these were not science stories in the traditional sense. Evidence followed to the best explanation. They were developed and promoted to discredit the Judeo-Christian worldview, which was believed to be foundational to the cultural distortions that had developed as Christendom between 400 and 1800 AD. To promote worldview transition to an enlightened secularism, science was reimagined in terms of an atheistic philosophy, materialistic naturalism, and a determination to exclude God from scientific discussions of reality. In Doubting Darwin number 1, I will demonstrate that Darwin's story of life's diversity suffers from 3 major flaws. Darwin admitted in Chapter 9 of The Origin of Species that known fossils look nothing like his story. He named 3 men with better science credentials who saw this as a serious problem. And he admitted that if it did not change in the future, it would doom his story. Experts have noted in the 1920s, the 1970s, 80s, and 90s that the fossil record looks like all of the major groups did appear distinct and fully formed at about the same time, while the intermediate and transitional fossil forms Darwin imagined are extremely rare and systematically missing. Those facts have been swept under the rug to preserve Darwinism. Second, unaware of the genetic limits on variation that Mendel would later explain, Darwin imagined unlimited gradual variation, eventually producing transformation, new limbs, new organs, and new body formats, so that protozoa gradually changed into pikes and porpoises, pythons, pandas, porcupines, parrots, pachyderms, and people. Third, to actually make these changes, Darwin borrowed Lamarck's idea of inherited adaptations, illustrated with an original short-necked giraffe actually stretching its neck a little, passing this on to offspring, generation after generation, until giraffe necks reached their current length. As it was learned that offspring inherit their parents' genes, not their boo-boos, in the 1930s and 40s, the change mechanism was switched to random genetic mutation, which every biology student learns are rare and then neutral or negative. But to preserve Darwinism, random genetic mutations were repainted as a marvelous miracle worker that tends to produce new and improved organs and body formats, if you just have enough time. In Doubting Darwin number 2, we will see that Lyell, Huxley, and Darwin's story of human origins has suffered from evidence problems from its beginning. It was admitted a century later that those 3 books were published without any direct fossil evidence to support the story. We will trace the meager and confusing evidence that accumulated after those books were published and the scholarly confusion it has produced. And in video number 3, we will see that the story of life's origin from inanimate matter by natural processes alone fits right in with the other 2 clunkers. Huxley and Haeckel's Monera story was thoroughly refuted by 1875. Darwin's assertion that life began with a mixture of chemicals in a warm little pond somewhere was imaginary fiction without any actual evidence, as were the assertions of Ernst Haeckel, Alexander Oparin, and J.B.S. Haldane. The Miller-Urey experiment in 1953 produced a few smudges of amino acids from electricity passed through a mixture of gases thought to represent the early atmosphere, but the gas mixture was later rejected, and nothing happened with other mixtures, besides the fact that amino acids are a long way from a protein and even further from being a living cell. In 1954, George Wald claimed that life arising from non-life by natural processes alone, spontaneous generation, was inevitable if one just had enough time. But in that same article, he admitted that Pasteur had scientifically disproven spontaneous generation, and it was impossible. Well, this makes sense when you realize that these stories were not formulated as science explanations for nature, conclusions drawn from a wealth of evidence to explain what's really happening in nature, but were philosophical speculations from men obsessed with a cultural agenda, discredit biblical supernaturalism, and promote an optimistic materialistic naturalism scenario with blind faith that evidence yet to be found would support them. We know the primary goal of the Enlightenment was to discredit and remove the supernatural from European thinking, because you can see it in the writings of its leaders between 1689 and 1789. And do not miss the fact that by rejecting biblical supernaturalism for materialism, the Enlightenment sowed the philosophical seed that would be foundational to the rise of Marxism in Russia, China, and North Korea. Darwinism leaps off the pages of Hitler's Mein Kampf, and it underlies the modern Western shift toward secularism. More recently, the elite shapers of modern Western science have occasionally admitted the agenda, their commitment to materialism, and excluding any consideration of a supernatural creator or designer from science or discussions of reality. Harvard biologist Ernst Mayr wrote quite plainly in 1974 that Darwinism was not simply about science, but worldview shift, moving Western civilization away from a worldview in which God is real and active towards a worldview in which there is no room for the supernatural. In effect, atheism. A few years later, biologist Richard Lewontin admitted that scientists are now biased by a commitment to materialism, although this perspective is not required by science, but it has retooled science so that it will now only yield materialistic explanations, and those involved are committed to materialism so absolutely that they cannot allow a divine foot in the door. In recent years, we have heard of political correctness, which is suspiciously similar to the old Soviet party line, the officially sanctioned ideology and terminology which all must subscribe to, or off you go to Siberia or to a psychiatric hospital for re-education. Pressuring a civilization to conform to an elitist ideological orthodoxy is not something new, nor is it limited to religious or political institutions, but is alive and well within the Enlightenment's zealous commitment to materialism and naturalism in science. In my 1965 general biology textbook, the author said that correct science required that the supernatural be excluded. Really? Scientific correctness? Well, what if accumulating evidence points towards a supernatural designer or other elements of biblical teaching? It doesn't matter, because science is no longer primarily focused on following evidence to the best explanation, for the explanation has already been philosophically determined. The supernatural was not involved, and gradual naturalistic development explanations are the only ones allowed consideration. When those in control identify the allowed and forbidden explanations before and apart from all available evidence, then we're no longer talking about empirical science, but are dealing with an authoritarian philosophical ideology. After 150 years of confident assertions, you know these stories are in trouble when evolution-friendly journals, noted intellectuals who still believe in Darwinism, and well-educated ex-Darwinists all identify and admit the same problems. As for Darwin's larger story on life's diversity, the January 24-30, 2009 issue of the journal New Scientist said it plainly on the cover: Darwin was wrong. As for Lyle Huxley and Darwin's story of human evolution, in 2021, the American Museum of Natural History admitted that the narrative on hominin or human origins is just a big mess. There's no consensus whatsoever. And Huxley, Haeckel, and Darwin's story of life's origin from inanimate matter by natural processes alone never moved beyond imaginary fiction. For in the 2011 Scientific American, John Horgan noted that geologists, chemists, astronomers, and biologists are as stumped as ever by the riddle of life. If you're ready to look at the specifics concerning those three stories, then please move on to these videos through the links provided on my website.